that is being used as a replacement for animal therapy in nursing homes, which is really kind of awesome.
So she built planets on Earth, you guys.
How are we doing tonight, everyone? I love that. We are a sold-out crowd here at the Museum of Science. Welcome to the museum and our very special live taping of Sing for Science featuring Patrik Svensson. Let's have it for Patrik. And of course, David Byrne. I'm James Monroe. I am the Creative Director of Programming here in our Centers for Public Science Learning at the museum, and I'm thrilled to be welcoming you all tonight. We're so excited to be launching a new partnership with Sing for Science. We have been fans of theirs for a while. This is our first event together, and we just love how they bring together artists and musicians in conversation with scientists and researchers. They are making science accessible, and they are making science fun. And those are two pillars that we strive for across the board here at the museum. So I just wanted to start tonight with a huge thank you to Matt Whyte, the creator and host of Sing for Science, for making this partnership happen. And of course, Patrik and David for making the trek up to Boston and sharing this conversation with all of us. It's going to be so interesting. I'm thrilled to say that there's more Sing for Science here at the museum to come, maybe sooner than you think. That's all I can tell you. But there's going to be a big announcement coming soon about our next event, our next guest. It is a big, exciting name on par with Mr. David Byrne. So I encourage you to follow the museum, follow Sing for Science on social media, sign up for both of our email lists. That way you can be the first to hear about the next event and grab those tickets. And as a part of tonight's event, our guests will take questions from all of you. So if you have a question, whether you're here with us in person or watching at home, thank you for tuning in from around the country. You can submit that by going to slido.com and entering the code SINGFORSCIENCE, all one word, just as it appears on your screen right now, and we'll get through as many of those as we can a little bit later on. And if you are here in person after the talk, we invite you to stick around, join us one level up for a reception, and you can get your book signed by Patrik. If you don't have a copy, you're in luck, because our friends from Frugal Bookstore are selling copies of the Book of Eels all night, so you can purchase that and then get that signed, so make sure you stick around. But now I'm so thrilled to introduce our very first special guest of the evening. To keep the night going, please join me in welcoming our president here at the Museum of Science Boston, Tim Ritchie.
Well, good evening, and it is such a pleasure to have everybody here tonight. You are going to get to hear about one of the great questions in all of biology, which is the great eel question. Really, it's quite an amazing story. You'll hear more about that. And this is all brought to you as a part of our Year of the Earth Shot. The entire year in the Museum of Science, we're going to focus on climate. We're going to focus on how can we live sustainably on Earth. And we started that in January, and we're going to continue 1,000 different learning experiences. And this is all brought by a center we have called the Center for the Environment. You know, how do we bring people science at the pace of change? How do we help people understand what's at stake? We deeply believe that when you're aware, you care. And that's what this night is all about. It's also brought to you by the Reno Family Foundation, and Jack and Susie would be so happy. If you could give the Renos a round of applause, that'd be just great. And I do want to show you just a little bit about that Year of the Earth Shot. So cue the video.
We know what to do. We have the tools, we have the knowledge, but do we have the will?
Once the water starts to rise, and heaven's out of sight, she'll want the devil on her teeth.
Today, the biggest question I get as a climate scientist is, what can I do about it?
What you know about your neighborhood can really help to have these conversations about how we can make our neighborhoods more resilient.
It begins.
I wanna fly, can you take me far away? climate change, all of this is science.
El Nino is coming.
How will rising sea levels impact air travel?
How can youth make big changes in their community that help relieve the effects of the climate crisis?
So that's our Year of the Earth shot and the Center for the Environment. If you want to know more, you want to join with us, we'll be doing this all year. Just a couple little things about the Sing for Science podcast. Such a natural partner for the Museum of Science. The mission is to increase science literacy for all. That sounds a lot like our mission statement, which is to increase a lifelong love of science in everyone. And their theory is that you come for the music and you leave with knowledge. Our theory is if you come for the wonder, you will leave with knowledge. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Matt Whyte. Thank you for bringing your show to Boston.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everybody. How are we all doing? So before we begin, I just want to give you a little bit of background about the show and why I started it. I'm a musician who is also interested in science, as I would discover. And about 4 years ago, it was the start of the pandemic, and I was on my couch in New York, and I had this idea. I thought, wouldn't it be incredible if I could get a member of Motley Crue to talk about their song, Kickstart My Heart, with a cardiologist? And I truthfully do love that song, but more to the point, I found myself wondering whether or not the electrical system in our heart has anything to do with the electrical system of a motorcycle starter. You know, you get to be my age, you start having sudden thoughts about Motley Crue, and you take it as nothing less than inspired. So I started this show, and while that collaboration between Motley Crue and Sing for Science is yet to materialize, I have had the good fortune to tape dozens of interviews, and I'll tell you about a few of them. Pop icon Sia came on to talk about one of her breakup ballads with an attachment theory psychologist. Arlo Guthrie talked about Alice's Restaurant with a nutritional anthropologist. Living Color talked about their 80s Reagan-era hit Cult of Personality with a fascism scholar. The singer of the heavy metal band Korn talked about his song Dead Bodies Everywhere with a mortuary science expert. That was interesting. And so in the last few months, I have expanded the format of the show to allow for artists of all stripes, be they musicians, visual artists, writers, actors, to come on the show, speak with scientists, science writers about one pre-chosen topic. And it's a spin-off, in essence, that I call Sing for Science Labs. So tonight's conversation about eels with David and Patrick will fall under that umbrella, as have episodes I've done on humanism, Carl Jung, and I'm pleased to announce that I'll be back here at the museum, and this is not the episode the taping that James was alluding to, but I'll be here in the fall with best-selling author Patricia Cornwell to talk about extraterrestrial life with Harvard astrophysicist Avi Loeb. So there's a lot going on. I hope you'll stay in touch, subscribe to the newsletter, sign up for the podcast. To that end, if you do as much and also give us a review, I'm giving away free merchandise. So afterwards, we're having a reception. You go upstairs. It's kind of an honors system arrangement. You scan, you give the review, and then you can take a piece of merchandise. So I hope that you'll take me up on that. I want to say a huge thank you to the museum, to Tim, to James, the entire staff. I'm so thrilled about this partnership. As I'd said, I started this during the pandemic, so all of the interviews were recorded remotely. So to be able to do this not just in person, but it's such an esteemed institution is a huge, huge honor for me. So thank you to them. This, of course, is a podcast, so it will be out next Wednesday. Should you miss anything, you can recap then. So with that said, we shall begin. This is Sing for Science Labs. I'm your host, Matt Whyte. Each episode in this series brings together artists and scientists to explore one topic of shared interest. Today's topic is the eel question, and our guests are musician David Byrne and culture journalist Patrik Svensson. David Byrne is one of today's great musician polymaths. Beyond his well-known work as singer and guitarist for Talking Heads, the iconic band he co-founded in 1975, David has amassed a dizzying list of pursuits that includes film, drawing, theater, neuroscience, prose writing, and more. Patrik Svensson is an arts and culture journalist based in Malmö, Sweden. His long-form debut, The Book of Eels, is a masterful and award-winning balance of eel ecology, science history, and personal memoir about his youth spent eel fishing with his father. Tonight's topic, the eel question, refers to how scientists and philosophers have for centuries wrestled with the enigma that is the European eel. Even in our advanced scientific age, we still don't have a clear understanding of how they reproduce and what triggers their migration across vast distances at the beginning and end of their life cycle. Museum of Science, please help me welcome to the stage David Byrne and Patrik Svensson. So, I guess, David, the first thing I want to mention is that in the weeks leading up to this, I would tell people that I'm going to Boston to speak with David Byrne about eels. Invariably, the response that I would get was, why does David Byrne want to talk about eels?
Well, the answer is, I read Patrik's book. It's a really wonderful book. It's beautifully written. The chapters alternate between personal stories and researched stuff about the eel and their life cycle and the mystery of that, which I won't get into. But that was it, and I think we met at like a backyard gathering of some friends in New York, and you said, do you want to talk about the eel book, to the man who wrote the eel book?
Yeah. Well, that's how it happened. The thing that keeps coming up is this idea of mystery. So before we talk about how it relates to the eel itself, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to mystery in general. I mean, just because I don't think it's a stretch to say the path your career has taken could be described as enigmatic. So I wonder, is mystery for you, is it a driver for your creativity? Is something that you seek out to solve, to observe?
I think maybe this will come up later in our talk about eels, because there's a lot of mysteries and that still exist about the eels. I know that when I'm writing something or working on a project, whether it's a theater project or a song or stage presentation or whatever, I often don't know what it's about until it's kind of done. And sometimes I don't even know what it's about until it's in front of an audience. And then I find out, oh, this is what this is about. So I don't start with this idea like, I want to do a thing that does this, and this is the meaning, and this is the message I want to get across. I discover through, it's sort of a mystery in a way, what that message or concept might be, and it reveals itself. For example, to give an example, years ago I did a project called Playing the Building, where I took an old organ and modified it so that the keys did mechanical things. So you'd press one and it would blow air through a tube, and that would blow air into one of the pipes in an old abandoned building. And another key would make a little hammer hit some other part of a building, and another one would use a motor to vibrate another part of the building. And there was a bunch of them, all mechanical. There was no amplification or speakers or anything. And I thought, oh, this will be about revealing to us the infrastructure in a building, the kind of buildings we live in. It turns out that's not what it was about at all. And once people got to it, I discovered that what it was about was the fact that anyone could play this thing. No one, and children would jump in and play it and have a great time, and then adults would go, oh, I'm not a trained musician. I don't know how to play an instrument. And then they'd see children do it, and then they'd go, oh, anybody could do it. There's no experts on with this instrument. So I realized that what it was doing was democratizing making music in that way, and that's what it was about. So that the mystery revealed itself. Sorry, long answer.
No, I don't want to get us too far off track, but I do want to know, do you remember that first moment when you had that idea of with the notes corresponding to different things, that first intuition?
Sort of. I thought, oh, it's a really simple idea.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, mechanically making that happen was really I needed a lot of help.
I would think, yeah.
But once it happened, yeah, then it just was fine.
And you let it play out.
I just let it play out.
And Patrick, I watched an interview with you, and you said something similar. You said, or at least it resonated with what we were just talking about, and David mentioned, at least, in the relationship of beginning and not really knowing where something's headed. You said, and I don't know what this was in response to, but you said you can have a scientific approach and still appreciate the mystery and what we don't know. So was that something that you kind of knew going in writing this book, and that was a sentiment you held?
Yes, I think so, very much, because my interest in eels is from the beginning a very personal thing, because my childhood I spent fishing for eels with my father, and I have extremely strong memories from this. Down by the stream, summer nights, just me and my father, the moonlight, the sound of the water, and the bats flying over us. And then, of course, when my father died, I started thinking a lot about this, and I understood that it was something that was very important for me. And I think also for my father, the eel fishing. The eels was something that it was our thing, It was what brought us together. And also my fascination for the mystery started right there, because we were talking about eels down by the stream. And my father told me about how special and mysterious these animals were. So it really started there.
Can I jump in?
Please, anytime.
Can you tell people about the life cycle of an eel? Can we jump into that?
Yes, because
sort of like get the background. So
yeah.
I mean, when I had no idea myself. I'm reading the book. I had no idea. I thought, oh, it's a fish.
Yeah.
It's a fish. It's like other fish. Mm-hmm. It's a different shape, but it's like a fish.
Yeah,
it's not.
I think maybe you need to talk about the life cycle, because it's a very unusual life cycle in the natural world, and it's one of the things that makes the eel a very special and compelling fish. All eels are born in the Sargasso Sea, in the western part of the Atlantic Ocean. Both the American and the European, but I mostly write about the European, of course. But they're born in the Sargasso Sea, and they're born as a small larva that's called the leptocephalus. It's a tiny creature that looks like a willow leaf. And these small willow leaves, they drift with the current. with the Gulf Stream, all the way from the Sargasso Sea to Europe. It can take like 3 years. And when they come to the European coasts, they transform. They go through a metamorphosis, and they become glass eels. Tiny, small glass eels that are completely transparent. They look like small glass rods. And these glass eels start to make its way up into the freshwater, into rivers and lakes, and they transform again. They reach the third stage. First they become elvers, and then they become what we call the yellow eel. There's the yellow eel. And this yellow eel at some point finds its place to be, and it stays there. It lives a very passive life. It doesn't move very much, and it can stay in this place for a very long time, 10 to 20 years, sometimes up to 50 years. Until suddenly one day this yellow eel suddenly knows that it has to go back to the place it came from. So they start traveling again out into the ocean, and they transform again for the last time, and they become silver eels. The colors change. They stop eating completely, and at this point is also when they get sexually mature. They develop the sexual organs. And these silver eels then swim all the way back across the Atlantic to the Sargasso Sea. And then that's the place where they breed, and then they die. And that's the life cycle of an eel.
Yeah, so it changes from one kind of creature to another. Kind of like a frog becomes a tadpole and then becomes a frog. Or a caterpillar becomes a moth or something like that. But this goes through like 3 or 4 completely different creatures. So it's kind of hard to conceive because we tend to think, well, what would that be like? So I had a question. Do you think as they transform, I'm thinking of the Greek myths and things like that, where the gods transform into a swan or into a deer or different kinds of creatures, but they always know who they are. Zeus or whoever always knows, this is me, I'm just in a different form. But does the eel remember its previous existence as a completely different kind of creature?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think it's hard to ask them, of course. But I think that the transformations is one of the things that's so compelling about the eel, beyond, because as human beings, we like to think that we could change, that we could become a new human, but we really can't. It's not a transformation, it's just a change of behavior or something. We don't take a new form. But the eel can take a completely new form. And the question, do they have a memory of their previous forms? There's actually some science about it regarding, the silver eel when it goes back to the Sargasso Sea. Maybe 40 or 50 years since when they were born there, and they go back to the Sargasso Sea. It's about, from Sweden, it's about 7,000 kilometers to swim. And there's a very simple question to ask: how do they find their way back? And that's something that scientists have struggled a lot with, and there's a lot of theories about how they navigate. But one of the things that many scientists say is that they have to have some kind of memory of their first travel from the Sargasso Sea to Europe. It could be maybe a memory of the smell or something else, but it's something that's like programmed into them.
And then whether they're conscious of that or not, they instinctively know, okay, it's time. I have to follow my inner GPS and transform into a silver eel and stop eating. For
Do they transform
months. Stop eating
before
for
they
months. This is not like a weekend fast.
Yeah.
But also, suddenly the yellow eel decides, I have to go back to the Sargasso Sea and become a silver eel. But there's a lot of difference when they do this, the last transformation.
How do they know?
Yeah, but how do they know when it's time? When they studied silver eels on their way back to the Sargasso Sea, and they looked at how old they were, it can vary from like 6-7 years to almost 60 years. And that's also something about the eel doesn't age like we do, you know. When it becomes the silver eel, it becomes sexually mature. It's like becoming an adult. But that thing can happen when they are like 6 to 7 years old or 60.
Here. I'm almost sexually mature.
Good for you.
So does the eel, do they know, does it begin its transformation from yellow to silver before it returns back to the Sargasso Sea, or does it happen once it begins?
It happens once it begins, and it happens during the travel, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, I remember reading in your book that I think one eel in captivity was able to survive without nourishment for 4 years?
Yeah, they don't eat at all when there are silver eels, and they can survive for several years, yeah.
Okay.
There's also another very interesting thing. If you have an eel in captivity, it never goes through the last transformation. It doesn't become a silver eel, and it doesn't become sexually mature if you keep it in captivity, because it's not able to go to the Sargasso Sea.
Somehow it knows. It's not like, oh, when I get to this age, I'm going to transform like a frog, or like a tadpole might change into a frog, even in a tank.
Because we have in Sweden, in the old times, they have the tradition to throw eels into the wells to keep the water clean or something. And those eels have proven to become extremely old. There's eels that's almost 90 years old who have lived all their life in a dark well, totally alone. There's stories about eels maybe being as much as 150 years old. If they don't have the ability to transform and go back to the Sargasso Sea, it's like they can almost live forever.
So somehow they know that if I can't get out of here and get to salty water, I'll just stay where I am.
Yeah, somehow they know, and then of course it's very difficult to compare consciousness, you know, from a human consciousness or an animal, but in one way or another they seem to know.
Patrick mentioned this, used the phrase sexual maturity. And in an eel, it's kind of extreme. It's the yellow eel, tell me if I'm wrong, does not have sexual organs. There's a great passage in the book where the very young Sigmund Freud, who else, is tasked as an apprentice to look for the eel's sexual organs. Can you find them, Sigmund? And he never did.
No, that's when you talk about the eel question. It seems to be a lot about sex, but it's an important thing when you talk about eels. The big eel question has for a long time been, how do they reproduce? How do they breed? And already, like Aristotle was studying eels 2,300 years ago. He wrote about eels, he studied them, and the big eel question, the big mystery for him was, how do they reproduce? So he studied the eels, he dissected them, and he couldn't find any sexual organs, of course. So he came to the conclusion that they don't reproduce. He said there's no sexual differences in an eel. There's no male and females. And he said they are actually born out of mud, born out of nothing. And this was an idea that stayed for a very long time. So in the middle of the 19th century, the science had still not proven that eels had sexual differences, that there were male and female eels. So the young Sigmund Freud, he was 19 at the time, he decided that he was the one that was going to solve this mystery. He was going to find the sexual organs in a male eel, or as he himself described it, he was going to find an eel testicle. That was his big, breakthrough as a scientist. So he went to Trieste in what's now Italy, and for about a month he studied eels and dissected them. More than 400 eels he dissected, and he didn't find one single eel testicle. And I think that's it's kind of funny too, This is the man, Sigmund Freud, of all people. His first scientific task was to understand the sexuality in a fish, and he failed. So he spent the rest of his life trying to understand the sexuality in human beings instead. And it was the man who developed theories like penis envy and castration and anxiety.
But this is one of the great...
It all comes from the eels.
Exactly. Yeah. But this is one of the great instances of understatement in your book, as I think you just describe it as how incredibly ironic that this man who's frustrated at his first endeavor in science, goes around accusing people of seeing phalluses everywhere, right?
Yeah.
We're not going to talk about Freud the whole time, but I'd like to read, if I can, read a little passage. There's a town near Trieste, Muggia, I think it's called. And what's impressive, Freud visited this town when was kind of struck by the women in this other town. Oh boy, here we go. So he writes about, this is from the book, he writes about how the women there must be particularly fertile, since virtually every other woman he saw was pregnant, and that the local midwives probably had no trouble finding work. He speculates, ironically, about whether the women might be affected by the marine fauna, making them bear fruit year-round, or whether they procreate at certain times altogether. So, crazy ideas, but I thought, but the idea, the eel's life cycle is so counterintuitive. It's as crazy as these ideas that Freud had. The eels, if you just said, oh yes, it turns into 4 different kinds of things and swims to the Sargasso Seas, because that is pretty far-fetched. And so I started thinking, well, there's other ideas that are equally far-fetched. The fact that the Earth moves around the sun, it certainly doesn't feel that way to us. And for millennia, people said, no, if the Earth moved, we'd all be blown sideways. So don't even think about that. Quantum, and Einstein called, spooky action from a distance and all that. It doesn't make any sense, really. So, I wanted to ask about this idea of an imaginative hypothesis, of coming up with that you have to imagine something that seems almost impossible when you're thinking about the mystery of the life cycle of the eel.
Yes, and I mean, the evolution is one of those far-fetched ideas, of course. But I thought a lot about this, especially concerning not only the eels, but the ocean. Because for almost all of humanity, the deep ocean was a place we couldn't go, we couldn't observe it, and therefore in the place of observation came imagination and fantasy. You know, there's a lot of mythology about what really was down there in the deep ocean. And still today, it's a very far-fetched idea what's really down there. Scientists today say that about 70% of the deep ocean is still completely uncharted. No one has been there, no one has observed it. They know very little what's down there. Some scientists believe that as many as 75% of all species in the ocean are still completely unknown to us. We haven't seen them. So when you talk about the mystery and all those things that are unknown or are not fully understood by us, it's in the ocean you should look.
And I think part of the mystery that you describe with the eel reproduction is that they've yet to see eels fertilizing the eggs, right? And this is because it takes place in like the deepest parts of the Sargasso Sea. This is the Sargasso Sea, and I'll let you answer that, and then I've got another question.
Yeah, that's one of the remaining mysteries about the eel, you know, because no one has ever seen eels reproduce, and they don't do it in captivity. They only do it in the Sargasso Sea as far as we know. And that's also one of these, I think the scientific history about the eel is full of those great stories about, when you ask yourself, how do we know the things we know? So how do we know that, how do we know then that all eels breed in the Sargasso Sea when no one has seen it? We know that because in the beginning of the 20th century, there was a Danish young scientist that decided that he was going to find the eel, the birthplace of the eel. His name was Johannes Schmidt, and they knew at that time that the eel becomes a silver eel and that it goes out into the ocean and disappears. And they knew that it never came back. But where did it go? So this Danish scientist, he decided to go out and find the birthplace, and he sails around on the Atlantic, and his method is to catch these small larvae, these small willow leaves, and measure them. And when the place where they were the smallest, they were also newly hatched, and that was the birthplace. So the only problem with this method, of course, is that those small larvae is very small, and the Atlantic Ocean is quite big. So it took some time. This Danish scientist, he sailed around the Atlantic Ocean for 18 years, catching these small creatures, until he found a place where they were really, really small and obviously newly hatched, and that was the Sargasso Sea. And that's why we know. That's the only reason we know, that we say that we know this. Still today, no one has even seen an eel in the Sargasso Sea. A mature eel. No one has ever seen a mature eel in the Sargasso Sea, alive or dead.
That was another. So no eel remains have floated to the surface.
No, never happened.
You'd expect there to be like dead ones because once they breed, they expire. But no.
No, and this is the. And I think one of the reasons why the theories that why they prefer to return there to spawn is this, I guess, is nutrient-dense seaweed called sargassum. Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Do they know that this is actually like that they require this specific type of nutrient to sustain them? I think
the scientists believe that the most important things are that the salinity and the temperature is perfect there for eel breeding, and that's the main reason that they have to go there. Okay. But maybe they are just stubborn. I don't know. Yeah. Tradition.
And David mentioned the GPS thing, and also you'd mentioned the sense of smell. So I think you also say they have the nose of a dog, and also maybe the magnetic sensitivity of a bird.
That's the theories, yeah.
But the fact that, going back to Aristotle and the whole idea of science is you discover something or see something by observation, and then, or if you have a hypothesis, you confirm it by observation. Mr. Schmidt got very, very close, but he never saw it. And no one has ever seen it. So technically, we can't say for sure that this is where they breed because no one's seen it. But circumstantial evidence is that it couldn't really be anywhere else.
Right.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And if you ask the question, how do we know the things we know about the world? The old tradition in natural science is that you have to observe something to be able to describe it and to be able to explain it. But when it comes to the eel, it's simply not enough.
Well, you know, this is one of the things that I love most about your book is that you go on such a deep dive in the science history, which is so fascinating. And the list of heavyweights that have tried to tackle this question is staggering. Aristotle, Freud, and Rachel Carson, right? So can you talk a little bit about and Rachel Carson, who we have to thank for the modern environmental movement with Silent Spring. So what was her relationship to the research surrounding the eel?
She was extremely interested in the ocean and everything that had to do with the ocean. But when she was a very young student and she got start doing science, she had actually had a tank with eels that she studied. And when she, most people know her from her last book, Silent Spring, but her very first book, that's called Under the Sea Wind, is partly about an eel traveling to the Sargasso Sea, where she uses her very special way to blend deep scientific knowledge with almost like a fairy tale and extremely beautifully written poetic language.
And this occurs to me. We should also talk about, because we're talking about the European eel primarily, which you knew from Sweden. So could you talk a little bit about how, what happens, because both the American eel and the European eel start out at the Sargasso Sea, allegedly. So what happens where if they're going, the European eel is following that current, the American eel diverts and goes to North America. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so both the American eel and the European eel, that's two different species. They're basically look the same, but it's two different species. And they're born at the same place, in the Sargasso Sea. And they are caught up in the Gulf Stream, the current, and they drift the same way, like north. And then suddenly, all the American eels just leave the current and go west. And all their European eels continue east to Europe. And the Danish scientist Johannes Schmidt, he asked the question himself, how do they know where to go? How do the American eels know that they have to go west? There's a more understanding of that now. It seems like the American eel grows a little bit faster, so it becomes bigger and stronger and can leave the current at the earlier time. But it's still quite a mystery.
But at what point do they recognize them as different species? When it's in that sort of larva state that Johannes Schmidt discovered.
Well, the American eel, it's just after like a couple of months, it suddenly seems to understand that we are American eels. We have to leave now. We
Makes
have to go our own way. And all the European eels say, goodbye, we have to go the other way.
I'll leave that without comment.
I mean, I could recommend the Ed Yong book, An Immense World, which is a lot about animal perception, which doesn't answer this question, but animals have all these forms of perception, magnetism and ultraviolet and et cetera, et cetera. Fish have ley lines, electrical sensors in the side, things that we can barely imagine. They're so far outside of our experience that it's hard to imagine. It's hard to even hypothesize how does the eel know to make a left turn and take the exit 22 for Boston. How do they know that? It's kind of beyond our ability to understand that intellectually.
Yeah, and that's also a very interesting philosophical question. You know, we talked before about Thomas Nagel, a philosopher who wrote a very famous essay in the 70s that's called "What is it like to be a bat?" And he explained that we can never truly understand what it's like to be a bat because our consciousness are so different. He meant that our consciousness is just the way how we experience the world through our senses. And a bat experiences the world mainly only by sound. And that's so far from our own consciousness that we can explain it scientifically, but we can never understand it.
Can we, taking that further, can we understand what it's like to be ourselves?
Oh, dear.
Oh, sorry.
What little grip I did have on reality, David Byrne took away.
Yeah. No, but can we really understand what it's like to be another person?
Yeah, or another person, yes.
Yeah. But this is what, I mean, the Nagel thing, my understanding is that is how what's used to describe is like the very elusive concept of consciousness. What is consciousness, right? And that's the first question people refer to. What is it like to be a bat? What is it like to be something? Yeah. That's the definition of consciousness. So the idea that we could ever figure out, the possibility of figuring out what it is that triggers an eel internally to begin this next stage of its life cycle seems near impossible.
Yeah, it is impossible, but when I wrote the book, I started asking those very simple, or almost like stupid question, like how does the eel perceive time, or how do the eel perceive the world? And it may be a very almost childish question, but there's a lot of very interesting science about this right now, about animal consciousness and most of all what this science has told us the last decades is that animal consciousness is way more complex than we thought it was before.
And is the eel one of the case studies, I would imagine?
No, not really the eel that much. I think they seem to prefer to study like birds or primates, but maybe someone will take up the eel too.
What about the eels in the Pacific? I know that they're considered a delicacy in Japan.
Oh, yeah.
Probably some people here have had unagi or something like that in a sushi restaurant.
Yeah, it's called a Japanese eel. It's not a species, but it looks exactly like the European and the American eel. And it has exactly the same life cycle. They didn't find the birthplace of the Japanese eel until the 1990s.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it's some close to what's the place? Guam in the Pacific Ocean. That's the birthplace of the Japanese eel.
So any of these other eels that are pictured here, do their life cycles, migration patterns, things like this resemble the European and American eel in any way? And the Japanese eel, obviously.
Well, you put me on the spot there because I'm no expert on the other species of eel, the relatives. But the European, Japanese, and the American eel are very similar and have the same life cycle.
Right. This is, David brought up the fishing with Japanese eels, so we should talk about the conservation component here.
How are the eels doing? Yeah.
Yeah, and not well is the answer. So these are staggering statistics. Can you tell us about these?
Yeah, well, the eel is not doing good at all. And it's extremely dramatic, the change. Since the 70s, more than 95% of the eel population has disappeared. And that is both the American and the European and the Japanese eel. They are simply disappearing, and they are very close to being extinct.
And this is an added layer to the eel question. They don't know why.
Yeah, that's the eel question today: is why do they die? And science is struggling with that now, and there's a lot of explanations, but they don't really know what's the most important explanation. But it has to do with climate change. Climate change affects the ocean currents, making it hard for the eel to navigate. There's toxic poisons, there's the fishing, there's the water power plant is a big problem for eels, and also different diseases.
And so is there anything that can be done besides closing hydroelectric dams?
Well, the conclusion that the scientists today have come up with is if the eel will survive, we just have to leave it alone, basically. We have to create waterways so that they can do their migrations. We have to stop climate change, and we have to stop pollution, and of course, it looks really, really bad.
And this is one thing that you had mentioned in another interview, and you just alluded to it right now, is what Rachel Carlson planted this idea about allowing creatures of all kinds to exist for their own sake, yeah?
Yeah, she did, and she had this. She talked also about empathy, that it's important not only to know things, not only knowledge, but to also be able to feel empathy for the natural world. She talked a lot about this sense of wonder, and she said that it's important to be able to feel the sense of wonder about nature, you know, because in this sense of wonder is like the seed both to knowledge and also to empathy. So that's something I think I really was trying to do with the eel. It also create a sense of wonder about it, because it's really is a remarkable animal.
So before we're about to go to the Q&A section, David, do you have anything else that you would like to discuss with Patrik about his book?
Well, yeah, I did a talk recently with some folks in Maine, in Waterville, Maine, where they are removing some dams. Some have been removed and more are being removed, and the ones that are still have hydro, they're building paths for fish and eels and things around the side. Not every fish can do the ladders, so they have to accommodate all the different kinds of fish that might go through. And in some places, this is kind of happening, which is kind of amazing. I mean, who would have thought? But of course, some of these dams were built 100 years ago for the logging industry, which is no longer there. And they're just, it was too expensive to tear them down. Yeah. So they had to raise money to tear them down. But that helps.
Okay. So This one just popped out at me. This is from Megan.
You've got questions from the audience?
Yeah, they may be here. They may be writing in virtually. This is from Megan. She says, 18 years sailing around the ocean to discover a tiny eel is a crazy life's opus. What's the longest time David's ever worked on one of his pieces of art?
Wow. I had a musical that ran on Broadway for a while, earlier this year, last year, something like that. And I started working on that, I think it was in 2008, maybe?
American Utopia.
Yeah, this was called Here Lies Love.
Okay.
And it was at least 2008. It might have been before that. So 15 years. I didn't get to 18.
Okay.
Not 18, but 15. And you think, oh, who would commit themselves to do something, take that huge chunk of their life and do something? Maybe Schmidt had the same thing where you make a little bit of a discovery, or you make a little bit of progress, and you go, oh, I found out that they go to the Azores or someplace, these islands. Now I just need to find out how they go, where do they go after that? And so one thing leads to the other, and you just don't give up.
Yeah. Okay, I hope that satisfies you, Megan. Moving on to Morgan. This actually taps into a great Jacques Cousteau sentiment. Why are people so interested in finding life in space when we still know little about life in the oceans on our own planet? P.S. Happy early birthday, David. Happy early birthday, David.
Why?
So is that, I mean, and you, I feel like you get into this a little bit.
Yeah, that's a good question, because people say that we know more about the surface of Mars than we know about the deep oceans, and I think it's maybe true. There's a technical answer. We haven't been able to go down in the deep ocean for almost all of humanity, but now we are. But maybe there's something about space that attracts the imagination more, because there's so much left to explore and understand in the ocean.
Okay. Do any yellow eels get lost on their way back to the Sargasso Sea to become silver eels? If so, what happens to them? That's from Sandy.
Oh, a lot of them never make it back to the Sargasso Sea. They did a very big experiment like 10 years ago or something. They put transmitters on 700 eels, releasing them from different parts of Europe, and they try to follow them back all the way back to the Sargasso Sea to answer the question, is that the place they are going? Out of all these 700 eels, not one came back to the Sargasso Sea. They all died on the way, and they lost their transmitters or disappeared for various reasons.
So is the conclusion they just knew they were being messed with, and they...
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, we're not going to tell you.
Yeah. What other changes of its body besides color happens in the transformations?
The biggest change is the transformation from yellow eel to silver eel. The fins grow larger, so they can swim better all across the Atlantic Ocean. Their eyes change, so they can see better on deeper down in the ocean. The eyes become blue, and not only do they stop to eat, all the what's it called, the digestive organs disappears completely, and instead they develop the sexual organs.
Okay.
Just unbelievable. Just okay. Yep.
David, forgive me, I just have to read this. Was Slippery People inspired by eels?
No, but okay, that's a good one.
Okay.
That's good.
Can yellow eels live in salt water, or is that part of why they transform into silver eels?
No, they actually can live in salt water, and actually some of the yellow eels never travel up into the fresh water, and they stay very close to the coast in salt water or brackish water and live there for all their lives.
Okay. Patrick, you mentioned theories about how the temperature and salinity of the Sargasso Sea may be important factors in why eels migrate there. With those factors in mind, are we seeing changes in eel behavior as our climate changes? Behavior specifically.
How the eel behavior
Yeah.
change with climate change?
Yes.
Well, when the temperature in the ocean changes, the ocean currents are affected, and the speed of the current, and also maybe the way it moves. So that's one of the. I think that's one of the biggest problems for eels today, that they are not able to find their way back to the Sargasso Sea because of that the ocean current has changed. Yeah. And it's also maybe affects the small larvae drifting with the current over to Europe.
Okay.
I can imagine that at some point the Sargasso itself starts to migrate further north.
Yeah.
And right, and this is something I think you mentioned in the book, right? That one of the reasons why they believe because it's such an astounding length to go from the Sargasso Sea to estuaries in Europe, and the question is, why would they go that distance? And one theory is that before the continents broke apart, that maybe it was a much shorter distance?
Yeah, exactly, because eels have been around for 40 million years, you know.
Mm.
The Homo sapiens have been around for about 300,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
So for 40 million years ago, the continents were much closer to each other. And for some reason, the eel has not been able to change their behavior during this time.
And are there male and female eels, and what determines the sex the eel assumes at sexual maturity? I mean, I imagine we don't know the answer to the second part, but that was one thing I wanted to know about was, you know, what's the difference when you try and sex these eels?
That's a good question because I don't really know, and that's one of the eel questions that still are not completely answered. Which ones become male and which one becomes female? There are some theories that it has to do with the temperature in the water and stuff like that, but there's really no complete answer to that.
JV here takes the Thomas Nagel question to the next level, and he says, what does God look like to an eel?
God?
God.
It looks like an eel with a beard.
Yeah.
Yep, that's it.
All right, JV, there you go. Are there any good Scandinavian eel myths?
Well, yes, there are some in literature and art, but one of my favorites, it's not really a myth because it existed, but there's a story about a boy in the middle of the 19th century that he catched an eel and he put it in a well at the house where he lived. And then that eel survived him and all his children and grandchildren, and 150 years later, a TV team was traveling to this well to try to find if this myth could be actually true, that the eel was 150 years old. And they actually found an eel in the well. And it was a very small eel, very pale. You know, 150 years in total darkness makes you kind of pale. But the eyes of the eels were extremely large, as if it had, during these 150 years, gone through some kind of evolution, you know, to handle the darkness in the well. Then they tried to determine exactly how old this eel was when it finally died. But they weren't able to do it because they didn't find, there's a big, small kind of stone in the ear of the eel that you have to find to determine the age, but they never found it. So this eel that could have been 150 years old, it took its secret with him or her.
Not surprising. How do eels generate energy to swim if they don't eat for years?
They use fat reserves. They build up fat reserves, and then when they stop eating, they can live out of them for several years.
Okay, here's one more. What is the greatest mystery about eels that science wants to know currently?
I think to be serious, the two big questions are: why are they dying? What can we do to save them? And the other question is: there's still a lot of the scientists that really want to prove that all eels are born in the Sargasso Sea, and that there's theories that maybe some of them are born someplace else. And so the question about exactly where all eels are born is still very much an eel question that's alive and kicking.
So, lastly, we're fortunate enough to have Patrik have a copy of his book up here. So before we all leave, Patrik is going to read a passage from here. I also, first of all, want to thank you all for being here, and remind you to please fill out your surveys, which I believe were left on your chairs, and also join us for a reception afterwards where you can have your book signed and get some free Sing for Science merchandise. So with that, and this is actually, a couple people had asked you to speak a little bit more about the memoir component of your book, which, you know, I read a lot of science books, and the memoir nonfiction template is very common, and it's just something that you do so incredibly elegantly. So many of you have the copy of the book. I encourage you to read this. With that, yeah, please read this passage.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to read just a short bit about me and my father fishing for eels. I can't recall us ever talking about anything other than eels and how to catch them down there by the stream. I can't remember us speaking at all, actually. Maybe because we never did. Because we were in a place where the need for talking was limited. A place whose nature was best enjoyed in silence. The reflected moonlight, the hissing grass, the shadows of the trees, the monotonous rushing of the stream, and the bats like hovering asterisks above it all. You had to be quiet to make yourself part of the whole. It could, of course, also be because I remember everything wrong. Because memory is an unreliable thing that picks and chooses what to keep. When we look for a scene from the past, it is by no means certain that we end up recalling the most important or the most relevant. Rather, we remember what fits into the preconceived image that we have. Our memory paints a tableau in which the various details complement one another. Memory doesn't allow colors that clash with the background. So let's just say we were silent. In any case, I don't know what we might have talked about if we did. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Museum of Science, please help me give it up for Patrik Svensson and David Byrne.
Thank you.